This week on the Marketplace of Ideas, part 2 of our special series on the future of books and reading with writer, thinker, entrepreneur, and maker of mischief Kevin Smokeler, as well as Dave Weich, Director of Marketing and Development at Powell's Books in Portland, Oregon. Kevin Smokeler is, according to his website, a writer, thinker, and maker of mischief. He's the editor of the anthology Bookmark Now, Writing in Unreaderly Times, and the chief evangelist and community director of Booktour.com. Kevin, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me on, Colin. I appreciate it.
Now, I just read off that job title, which was writer, thinker, maker of mischief. What exactly, what is your job, really?
Well, first and foremost, I call myself a writer, which I have done professionally since 1995. But beyond that, I'm also involved in a number of digital projects, primarily of which is Booktour.com. I'm the co-founder of that community and its chief evangelist. And in my consulting practice, I'm often brought in, particularly to speak with professionals in the publishing industry about the future of the business and the audience response to books and literature. So I like to call myself a maker of mischief because often what I'm asked to do is shake up established paradigms and cause a little trouble.
How did you get to the point where you were giving advice out to publishers and to authors and to booksellers and to that whole establishment? Where did you get to the point where you said, this is something that I am definitely qualified to speak on?
Way back in 1999, I ran an online community called centralbooking.com, which is no longer around. And it was a community for people who loved books and literature. And at the time, early on in the history of the site, I started getting books sent from publicists and publishing professionals asking for coverage on the site. And I would ask them what I thought was a perfectly logical question, which is, where is the website for this book, or where is this author's website? And what I would often get was a lot of shrugs. At the time, I was also living in San Francisco and friends with many of the people who had invented the technologies which became the building blocks of Web 2.0. I was friends with the folks who invented Flickr and Blogger and Movable Type and some of those programs. So I knew a lot of bloggers, and when word got out of that amongst several of the publicists who had been sending me books, they asked, well, how do you go about approaching bloggers to cover books? Central Booking was around 1999 to 2003, and in the years immediately following that, I did do a fair amount of work matchmaking bloggers and books and authors, and it became known informally at the time as the Virtual Book Tour, which was a title I had borrowed from a blogger friend of mine who had done something similar a couple of years before. And I think a combination of those two projects is where my expertise on the future of how people become aware of books, how they consume them, and how they interact with books and with the cultural product that is a book and an author came from. And also just being 34 years old, growing up in the 70s and 80s, at the beginning of this giant explosion of media, first cable TV, then early video games, then the internet. I grew up in a household where books were primarily consumed for enjoyment, and they were consumed as vigorously as CDs and records and television and movies. So the idea that books were simply another piece, an equally important piece of culture as the rest of them, led me to believe that their evolution as to how they're consumed should follow the same path as music and movies and those kind of things. And who knew that was a radical idea?
I want to get back to the scene you described where you go to these book people and you ask, where's the website, and they just shrug. Why was there so much ignorance of the web and of everything you could do online on the part of the book community?
I wish I had a good answer to that, Colin, but this is as best I can come up with. The generation I grew up in was the first generation to have personal computers in the homes. And I also grew up in a family that was filled with books from floor to ceiling in most rooms, including the bathroom and the basement furnace area. As a result, I never saw being interested in technology and being interested in books as two different things. I would play old Infocom games and then go read. And when the early Infocom games, which were simply text adventure games, you are standing in front of a house. There is a mailbox, and you would type "open mailbox." To me, that was no different than a choose-your-own-adventure book, which I read as a child voraciously. So I can never quite put my finger on why people who read voraciously are often people who are frightened of technology. It seems to me this lingering holdover from mid-century romance of commerce and culture, where technology was seen as the faceless instrument of the war machine, and literature was seen as the gentle hand of the cultured elite. That's the only explanation I have, and that's not a very good one. But for some reason, people in publishing seem to find technology alien and foreign, and I've never quite understood that, because throughout history, books have often been at the forefront of technology. We need only go back to movable type and the Gutenberg Bible.
Now, since then, since you initially got those shrugs when you asked about websites, have the publishers come along very much due to your own efforts and the efforts of others? Are we in the same situation? Has there been a lot of improvement, or some, or...?
There has been some improvement. I can only take credit for a very small amount of it, and that's mostly the people the people who work in the industry that I've come in contact with, and an even smaller amount that I've influenced. I don't think any one person can take a large amount of credit for it. But I certainly see some improvement. I see an author's website is now de rigueur instead of a luxury that they have if they have a skilled nephew who graduated with a computer science degree. Most publishers are sprucing up their own websites to add interactive features, to add social media features. The docket at BEA next week in Los Angeles, Book Expo America, the educational docket is filled with programs about social media and Web 2.0 technology. So there's certainly an increased awareness of it. How effectively these technologies have been deployed, I think, remains to be seen. But the knowledge is there, and as a younger and younger generation becomes employed in the publishing industry, and as that same generation becomes less and less interested in books, not because they don't like to read, but because we're simply not communicating with them in the way they're used to, I think the changes will become imperative rather than something we'll get to when we get to it.
So here's the million-dollar question for you. What do you think, what opportunities are authors and publishers missing out on that could be provided by technology? Just ones they're not seizing. What could they be doing? Well,
speaking completely selfishly at first, I run Booktour.com, which is the world's largest directory of author events, online and 100% free. Our event listings go out to thousands and thousands of people every week in all 50 states and several countries, and are also posted on social networks like Goodreads.com and Shelfari.com. Any author who isn't listing their events with us is missing out on exposure to thousands and thousands of readers. Authors, particularly in more technologically astute genres like science fiction and graphic novels, can be making use of, especially if they're visual genres, can be making much better use of photo sharing sites like Flickr, quick update sites like Twitter. MIT Press does a fantastic job with its Facebook group because it has a technologically astute audience. The people who, unfortunately, are often left behind in this conversation are the grand old men and women of book publishing, which is literary fiction. What do you do about literary fiction? Nobody seems to have quite cracked that nut yet. I'm hoping they do because we all love to read it, and I'm hoping the inclinations of people who write literary fiction doesn't remain shy and technologically averse forever. But I think that's starting to change.
It's become a bit of an unquestioned assumption that people will say, oh, reading is dying, books are dying, no one reads anymore. People have been saying this for over 20 years, I would say. How accurate would you say those statements are? And I'm guessing not very considering what you've built your career upon, but what do you make of these ideas that linger around that say that books are on their way out? Everybody's going to stop reading any day now.
There was a wonderful piece in the Village Voice a few years ago by Paul Collins, who's a wonderful author and someone who contributed to my book, Bookmark Now, in which Paul actually researched the reading is dying claims throughout history, and apparently they've been around for, 100 150 years at least. John Stuart Mill, the famous philosopher, was convinced that newspapers would be the end of reading, because a newspaper, is a nickel and arrives on your doorstep, and why would anybody have to go to the library or buy a book any longer? Penny postage was accused of killing reading. Automobiles were accused of killing reading because everybody would be tooling around in their Model Ts, and why would anybody read Theodore Dreiser if driving and making out with your girlfriend is so much more fun? It's never happened. I think reading faces enormous challenges today simply because there's so much competition for people's leisure time. However, much of that leisure time is taken up with the kind of reading we don't typically associate with sitting down next to the fireplace with a nice paperback book. People read like crazy on the Internet. People have RSS readers filled with tons and tons of feeds. Newspapers and magazines are consumed online at vigorous rates. People are reading. The Internet is a reading and writing medium when people aren't watching movie trailers or playing video games. We simply need to think of what it means to read differently. Does it mean shorter pieces? Does it mean longer sustained reading, but simply in a different format? As long as publishing is wedded to the idea of reading being ink on paper between two covers that you sell like a commodity, it's going to go the way of every other commodity-based media industry like music and like film, which are all suffering from this idea that we're still in the business of selling things instead of in the business of selling culture and the experience around that culture.
So we're talking here about companies wedded too strongly to a certain specific form of a product, a specific thing that they need to move. They've made their business a thing, and that's their problem?
I think it is, in an economics 101 kind of way, it's their problem. If you look at different kinds of industries and media operations who get tremendous brand loyalty from their association with books, if you look at National Public Radio or any high class lecture series in a major city in the United States, all of these places have an association with books that quickly morphs itself into an association with education, with sophistication, with good taste. And there is enormous amount of hay to be made from being associated with good taste and sophistication. I mean, Godiva Chocolates built its whole business on that. Ostensibly the Toyota Prius is entirely based on that, throwing in green consciousness and environmental awareness. But publishing, in its most traditional sense, seems wedded with the idea that we are essentially peddlers of dry goods. We are essentially peddlers of things. And if they believe a book is so much more than a thing, which I believe they do, it's time to start being in business with something that's a lot more than a thing. Selling a book as a thing is like saying you go out to eat for food. You can have, to nourish your belly. You can have food at home. What you go out for is the experience. And publishing has yet to figure out what is the experience we associate with books and the act of reading. And it's a profound one, as you and I both know.
I want to go back to your book, Bookmark Now, and the subtitle of which is Writing in Unreaderly Times. What makes these unreaderly times? What are unreaderly times? I guess I should also ask.
I've never felt entirely comfortable with that title. I think it's provocative, and I think it creates conversation, two things I love. The book argues, though, that we're only living in unreaderly times if we have a very narrow idea of what readerly is. I talk about this with many people in the publishing industry and fellow authors as well. We have a very narrow idea of what someone who reads is and looks like and is interested in. And we typically think of them as rather bookish, rather antisocial, rather frightened by the direction the world is going, and rather opposed to what they see as crasser forms of media and culture. And speaking only for myself, I say that's simply not true. It's a very narrow and confined vision of what we see as someone who's interested in books. And I think the very first step we need to make, if we want to improve the sense of what it means to be living in readerly times, is widen our idea of what it means to be a reader. And someone who maybe buys 2 or 3 books a year and always grabs, what they hear everybody talking about at work, and maybe 2 or 3 computer books and a couple of novels at Christmas or something like that, that person is just as much a reader as someone who prowls the shelves of your favorite used bookstore on a Saturday afternoon. They may not stand up and call themselves that, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't, and that doesn't mean we as a reading culture shouldn't include them in the fold.
When I had David Hewlin on the show last year, the editor of the LA Times Book Review, we discussed a bit of a garrison mentality that seems to have formed around you might call them the hardcore reading community. Mm-hmm. The idea that reading is better, it's smarter, we're defending ourselves from barbarians at the gates. He seemed to think that's what puts reading at risk, is the attitude that this is something fundamentally better to be doing and best to just display that face to the world. If you're not good enough to do this activity, stay out. And how much do you agree with that assessment?
First, let me say, when I listened to that show with David on your podcast, I think I stood up and cheered when he said that. David is one of the smartest people in our business. I've been fortunate enough to write for his section on several occasions. And I think he's absolutely right. I think if you look at the history, you look at cultural history in this country, you'd be hard-pressed to find an activity that has survived and thrived by circling the wagons, that has survived and thrived by its own sense of snobbery and self and entitlement. It is simply not a recipe for a long life. It is, in fact, a panicked fight or flight reaction that sets in when someone is afraid, fears irrelevancy. And it doesn't work. You know, the same way we can say in a much larger sense that fear is never the answer to change. Change is an opportunity to do better, to be better, and to see yourself as bigger than you once did. I agree completely with David, and I reject the sentiment of that group of hardcore readers. I had a wonderful conversation with Oscar Villon, who's the editor of the book review page at the San Francisco Chronicle, who I've written for several years, where Oscar said, you know, when I was a teenager in working-class San Diego, if you had shown me those people, those hardcore readers you mentioned, Colin, and told me that was what I was going to be as a grown-up interested in books, I would have run away from books and never come back. We are setting a terrible example for what it means to be interested in literature if we yoke it to pretension and snobbery and uninclusiveness. Because who wants to repeat a drama from junior high school with something you're supposed to enjoy doing in your spare time?
This is a bit of an idea that's come around, or maybe has always been around, of, I believe as you called it on the blog, books as broccoli, a sort of eat your greens mindset, that this is something you should force yourself to do to make yourself a better person. How do we defeat the books as broccoli notion?
The difficult answer is it's part of a larger problem. It's part of a larger mid-century canonical hangover that we have with regards to literature, which comes from a time when there was a finite amount, when we thought that there was a finite amount of good books every person should read, and reading them was like taking your broccoli. You did it because it was quantifiable, and it was a way that society understood you could make yourself a more cultured and enlightened human being. In the era of the Internet, it's fair to say that cultural broccoli no longer exists. The notion of what is good for us is entirely subjective because everybody is free to explore a vast array of what might be good for us. People who love books and people who are in the book business for a living need to get realistic with the times we're living in and say, yes, there is a vast array of things to choose from, but as such, perhaps you need a guide or a trusted friend to make good suggestions. And so the book business needs to, in attitude and in action, shift itself away from saying "trust us," which is what you do when you effectively put a book on the shelf with an author nobody's ever heard of that isn't approachable or doesn't do a lot of marketing and outreach for themselves. What you're effectively saying is trust us, and publishing houses have not earned that trust. None of them are in the position Apple is in, where it can put anything out and say trust us, and people will say absolutely, you're Apple. There is no Apple in publishing, which is a shame because there could be and there should be. So they have to shift away from this hierarchical top-down approach to book promotion and awareness, which is effectively saying, trust us, we're the publishing industry, to a more lateral, horizontal, networked approach, which is, here are the people in the publishing industry. We are real people just like you. This is not a castle with high walls. It, in fact, has an open gate that you may come in as well. And it's a shift we're seeing everywhere in culture, from top-down hierarchical models to flat networked models.
How important do you think it is for these publishing companies to get in touch, to remain in contact with prominent internet opinion leaders like bloggers? How useful could they be?
Most high-profile bloggers that I know like to read. And the smart publicists are already in touch with those people. Those people are as besieged with demands at their own scale as the New York Times. Not in sheer numbers, but commensurate with the amount of readers they get. As such, it's just as hard to get coverage on a high-profile blog than it is, in a high-profile newspaper or magazine. That said, the shifting face of publicity in all forms, not just in books, in terms of books, is a sustained long-term relationship building, which is that you may make contact with a blogger that has 50 readers, but they may be exactly the right 50 readers. And if that person is low maintenance and doesn't make heavy demands on your time, and all it costs you is an email and a book sent in the mail, then it's a relationship probably worth having over the long term. That is a shift that is happening in publicity and public relations of all forms. I'm hoping it comes to book publicity sooner rather than later, but that hasn't been the case thus far.
We mentioned earlier about the excessive attachment, the too strong attachment of companies to the idea of books as actual physical books, as objects. But I did want to make sure to get to the business of selling these objects and of what these objects might become. First thing, what is your take on independent bookstores and the news that you and I and everyone else who reads constantly sees about this bookstore closes, that bookstore closes, Dutton's in L.A. recently folded. Mm-hmm. What's your take on what's going on there and why?
Oh, man. Do we have another 4 hours?
I can edit it, I guess.
I'll put it as simply as I can. I love independent bookstores, and any time I'm in a city for work or for pleasure, that's the first place I go. And I fall right into that cliche of getting lost in an afternoon amongst the shelves of an independent bookstore. It's one of the great pleasures of my life, and has been since I was a very young child. I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, right down the street from the original Borders Books when it was an independent bookstore. So that's been ingrained in me from a very young age, and I will continue to do that for the rest of my days. That being said, I feel my approach to change is smart people see change as an opportunity. Complaining, bemoaning, wishing things were different than they were is a sign of someone who is not ready for the future nor deserves it. The smartest independent booksellers I see, and the ones who I know will survive, stand up, of course, when there is an injustice, as we've seen with Book Passage here in Northern California, protesting the discounts the chain bookstores have gotten, rightly so. But what they are fundamentally saying in words and in action is, don't cry for me. Don't cry for me. I know what I'm doing. I am a smart bookseller and a smart business person, and I am prepared for change. And I am willing to make that change because the world demands it of me, and that's what it means to operate that's what it means to operate a retail business, which is also a public institution like a bookstore. Dave Weich, who I know you're going to talk to, is one of the smartest people in independent bookselling today. And I've known Dave for many, many years, and Dave has never once asked me to show sympathy for the cause of Powell's because he knows that the changes that are happening are a call to action, and times of change are the most exciting time to be in any endeavor. I'll say a quick word about Dutton's. My cousins live around the corner from Dutton's, and they're who I stay with when I come to Los Angeles. I was incredibly sad to hear the news of it going, and I would not be, and I'm hardly in a position to say this would have made a difference. But my cousins, we used to go shopping at Dutton's when I would visit them, and we would walk in the courtyard at Dutton's, and my cousin would shake her head and say, "I can never find anything here." She's a working mother with a small child. She can never find anything here. She says, "I'd love to shop at Dutton's, but I can never find anything here." And I remember thinking, wouldn't it be great if Dutton's had a desk in that courtyard and a person sitting behind it and a sign overhead that said Dutton's Concierge, so whenever you walked into that courtyard, they could say, "Welcome to Dutton's. What can I help you find?" I never knew Dutton's had a parking lot. Dutton's has a giant parking lot behind it, so there were several occasions when I couldn't go to Dutton's because I couldn't park my car. I am not a bookseller, and I am no genius when it comes to these things, but these seem to me to be the basic tenets of retail practice. why are they revelations to people in the independent bookselling community?
Now, you've partially answered a question that I was going to ask you. I guess I'll kind of ask it anyway. And that is, whenever I see the news of a bookstore closing, and this, of course, the reasons they close vary. You know, Dutton's, he didn't own the building, so there was some trouble there. But let's say a bookstore does own the building, a bookseller owns the building, and it goes under, you know, the sales have been slow and what have you. Now, I always think to myself, it's too bad to see a place like that go. But then I also think to myself, well, you know, there must have been some reason they were failing the customer somehow, because those customers didn't just stop buying books. And how much merit would you say that thought has? Where, you know, it's probably not just the fault of the internet, probably not just the fault of Barnes and Noble and Borders, who always take the flak.
Right. I mean, I think you're exactly right, Colin. Borders and Barnes and Noble and Amazon. Amazon has been around for going on 15 years now. Borders and Barnes and Noble longer. So I think anyone who closes right now, unless those companies did something really, really predatory or bordering on illegal, which I've heard of, but I don't think is very common. There has to be something that's the matter. There has to be something that bookseller was not providing for its customers, because that's simply a basic principle of capitalism. No. If you are not providing what your customers want, they go elsewhere. Particularly something that has been known about, like competition from chains internet bookselling for a long time. I did an informal look not too long ago. I'm part of a book lovers discussion community called Readerville, and every time someone posted a headline of a bookstore closing, I would go and see if that bookstore had a website. And I would say on about 75% of the occasions, they didn't.
Wow. That's impressive that a business in 2008 would not have a website.
It's crazy, isn't it? And I don't know if that's that same aversion to technology that we see so prevalent in people involved with books, or if it's simply the culture and personality of people who run bookstores. I don't know enough about bookselling to say for sure, but I get the sense that booksellers, I get the sense that independent bookselling exploded in the 1960s by people who were very smart and not interested in working in traditional lines of work. And so they became independent booksellers, and there's an idea from that they had set up their own world and set up their own way of working that worked for them. And you know, it's very difficult to see change as a positive thing when retreat from the world, the biggest change you can imagine, was what got you there in the first place.
Yes, I get the impression from some booksellers that, I don't know if they actually think this, but it's what I tend to receive from them, the idea that they are somehow entitled to thrive by virtue of being an independent bookseller. And I'm thinking to myself, no business is entitled to thrive.
Absolutely. I think, booksellers that think that their future is in, community support a la the local public radio or television station, and some bookstores have been very successful with that. Kepler's has a very successful Friends of Kepler's program. I think that's fine. I personally don't think it's sustainable, but I don't think there's anything immoral or illegal about operating that way. But you're absolutely right. I mean, no business is entitled to thrive simply by virtue of what it is. And if it thinks it is, it has to make that case to its customers, and its customers have to agree. I certainly don't think it's entitled to make that decision on its own.
Now, continuing into the thread of books as objects, and we're running out of time, but I really want to get your ideas on this. I talk to friends about books, the physical things, what might succeed them, what might augment them. Some friends put their money on e-books that you might read on a Sony e-reader, for example, on a Kindle. Some put their money on print on demand. That's kind of where my money would be put on, were I to put money on it. What's your take?
I think what we will see is the act of reading and the act of purchasing a book exploding into a million different directions, similar to what we're seeing in the music business right now. That music is no longer just a CD. It's something that streams on your computer and in your car radio and in your telephone and in your television, and it is everywhere. It is, in fact, ubiquitous. And I think we will see text, and it's not as easy as music, but I think we'll see text attaining the same kind of ubiquity. And it will be print-on-demand books where nothing is ever out of print again, and every bookstore will have a little machine in the back that can create a book for you in an instant if it's not on the shelves. And then bookstores will truly become places not just of retailing but of experience and community gathering. I think there will be a move towards e-books, but until an e-book reader becomes until you can take it in the bathtub or until it doesn't run out of batteries or until the screen becomes as pleasant to read as a regular book, I think it's going to remain the province of reference books and more functional kinds of reading rather than reading for pleasure and enjoyment. For my money, the most important thing that needs to happen for books is, and I'll sound juvenile saying this, is we need to start seeing books as fun. We need to start seeing the act of reading as what it is, which is, to a very large extent, a hedonistic pleasure. There's nothing more fun than reading a book and being told a story just to you. It is as indulgent as eating a rich dessert. And yes, there is enlightenment and wisdom to be gained from that, or else, we'd all just be eating rich desserts all the time. But fundamentally, is an act of enormous personal pleasure. And we have divorced that pleasure from what it means to be a reader. And God willing, we'll get it back, because it's such a shame to deprive the culture of the great pleasures and joys associated with reading, simply because we're stuck on this old-fashioned model of books being good for you rather than fun.
Well, this isn't a show of my opinion, but I have to say I completely agree. Kevin, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Oh, thank you for having me, Colin. You're welcome.
It's music that you got to touch and feel, you know what I'm saying?
Dave Weich is the Director of Marketing and Development at Oregon's Powell's Books, one of my favorite bookstores ever. In fact, no, I'm pretty comfortable calling it my favorite bookstore ever in this country or any other. He's also worked on 2 out-of-the-book films about books and authors made in association with Powell's. Dave, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
You work at Powell's, and how cool is that to any book nerd? How did you get to that point? How did you get to that mecca of book geekdom?
It was really complicated. I answered an ad in the newspaper. I've been here for 10 years, and it is really great. It's an amazing place to work, a lot of fantastic people, incredible benefits, not least of which is being, in close proximity to all these books. And it's a really interesting company, kind of constantly looking to improve, which is a kind of a fun thing, always a new challenge.
I was talking to Kevin Smokeler. He's actually the first part of this 2-part episode of the program, and he was saying that independent bookstores, they tend to ignore technology at their own peril, but Powell's has not been, to say the least, a place that has ignored new technology. In fact, their online presence, if I have this right, was one of the very first for any bookstore. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, though.
Yeah, it's true. We went online in 1994, which was prior to Amazon. And it was really just the kind of ingenuity and curiosity of some of our employees. There were a couple people in our technical bookstore who, were paying attention to things that were happening at the time in technology, and basically went to Michael Powell with an idea that said, hey, if we post our inventory online, people could look at it and maybe buy books from us, even if they don't live here. And that was really the start of it. It's been 14 years since then, and we've just been kind of chipping away at it since, growing and growing.
It's kind of hard to believe that any business has had an online presence for 14 entire years at this point, but Powell's being, I suppose, the early adopter of that online model. Now, what has that presence gotten Powell's in those intervening 14 years?
Well, a lot of things. I mean, I think that it's hard to even imagine what our business would look like now if we didn't have our web presence. We have about 80,000 people on the site every day. Those people are all over the world, predominantly in the United States, but a decent, maybe 5% of the traffic, actually about 5%, a little more than 5% is from international customers. And really, it's just given us an opportunity to take advantage of the way the industry and the technology has evolved. I think the key for us was getting in early. We're not a private company. We're not a public company. We are a private company. We don't have venture capital money. which at the time, particularly during the dot-com boom, companies were growing very, very quickly, and we've never had the resources to do that. But because we've been at it for so long, I think we've built a really interesting, engaging site. Like I said, it just kind of keeps evolving.
One of the other things I was talking with Kevin about was that you look at a lot of bookstores today in 2008, and they don't even have websites, let alone one as innovative as Powell's has been. Now, how much you explain that divide where Powell's has this whole cool thing, but many, if not most bookstores, they sort of look down on having an online presence?
Well, I think, I wouldn't pretend to speak for, all other booksellers, and I do think that there's a lot of, there are a lot of different reasons why bookstores are in the places that they are now. The single biggest one is just the cost. Again, we got in very early, and I think by doing so, we had a tremendous advantage, really. For one thing, all sorts of companies have come to us over the years and said, hey, we'd love to be affiliated with Powell's. For whatever reason, you're doing something that we think will resonate with our business and our potential customers. So, hey, we'll do this for you for free if you will agree to work with us while we're in beta. And again, being in a position to take advantage of those kinds of offers that came along and still continue to come along now and then has really allowed us not just to grow, but to learn about what's going on in the industry, where things are moving, what people are experimenting with. And, if you didn't start way back then, at some point there is, even for us, there always is, there's a capital investment. The book business does not have big margins. These are not, they're not big businesses. They tend to be, most bookstores are pretty small operations, and they don't necessarily have a deeply skilled technical staff, which is another thing. It's not just buying servers, it's the technical staff, which doesn't come cheap. And I think for all those reasons and more, the simplest one probably being that, I don't know that many bookstore owners, certainly of the past, got into this business because they were friendly or excited about technology. And most of them, most of the ones that I'm in contact with, do something online now. And I think that what's happening is you're seeing stores figure out what kind of niche they can serve or what particular tools they can have and offer their customers. They're not necessarily going to try to compete with an Amazon, but they do think that the web can offer tools and services basically to improve the relationship between the store and its local customers.
You mentioned a bit earlier about the early days of the website and how the technical bookstore, which for those who are unfamiliar is a branch of Powell's, not too far from Powell's, but specializing in technical books. It's like it's down the street, as I remember from last time that I visited. Now, you talked about what they brought to the table. How does having that technical bookstore, how has that helped?
At this point, it's kind of a separate endeavor in the sense that we've been at it for a while, and we've kind of grown the web part of the business so that we have a full-time staff over here specialized in doing whatever it is that each person does. But, particularly in the early days, I think it was incredibly useful to have a lot of people who were really invested in technology and in change, because, again, that's not necessarily a common characteristic of the book industry. It exists where it exists, but it certainly wasn't a prerequisite for people getting into the book industry, let's say, in 1970 or 1980, even in 1990. And so I think having that internal knowledge, and even more so, just the enthusiasm for it, really made a difference, through, let's say, 1998 or 1999 and 2000, at which point, now we were kind of in the middle of the dot-com boom, and internet browsers were becoming more and more common, and more people were getting online. At that point, I think some of the opportunities and the challenges were more evident in themselves, and it became a larger executive conversation within Powell's. But I definitely think that the people in the tech store were crucial in just getting it off the ground and getting people on board.
Would I be correct in gathering from what you're saying that the presence of technology geeks as well as literature geeks, to put it in a sort of humorous way, that helped Powell's, whereas the tech geeks were missing from a lot of bookstores and book-selling enterprises before?
I think so. Like I said, it's complicated. There are money and resource questions. There are certainly vision questions in terms of what any given business owner wants to do with their store. But yeah, as I said, the technical expertise doesn't come cheap. It didn't then, and it doesn't now. But if you have staff on hand, and this is something that I kind of, advise a lot of booksellers, that it can be overwhelming to look and say, oh God, what do I got to pay a programmer? But, a lot of booksellers have 19, 20-year-old kids working in the aisles who probably have fairly complicated websites of their own, blogs, and they're using widgets, and they're on all the social networks. And I just tell people, hey, give that person an extra $1 or $2 an hour and let them play and build their resume, and suddenly you're going to have some infrastructure of your own. And I think to some extent that's what happened at Powell's. There were people to whom this work was exciting, and suddenly a job that they had always viewed in one particular manner, I buy books, or I operate a section, or whatever it was the person in the store was doing, suddenly they were able to diversify and do some things which were of more personal interest and be compensated for it. And so I think that internal availability really simplified the process. It removed a lot of the obstacles of the fear of the unknown.
You say that, and it reminds me of a little of what Google has been doing as far as letting its employees do a bit of exploration, but then being able to themselves use it as a corporate entity to grow and to change with the market.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the challenge then becomes managing that, and how long is the leash, how are the rewards, distributed, and there are questions that come with that. But I do think bookstores do have a lot of very creative people, and I'm never worried about us having a shortage of book experts on staff. The challenge is much more often, let's get people who have other specialties and backgrounds and experiences, because we have hundreds and hundreds of people who can talk for days about books. The trick is, again, diversifying that and making sure that you have people looking at things from different angles, and people who are reading tech magazines and whatever the item of interest might be.
And this very scale of Powell's is something that Powell's fans always think of when they think of the store. And I wanted to know what you thought about how the sheer size of the operation has helped in terms of success technologically and otherwise. And maybe you should describe how big Powell's is for those who've never been there.
Well, we operate 6 stores in the Portland area, but we're known, Portland, Oregon area, we're known mostly for our downtown store, which is called the City of Books, and it's about 70,000 square feet of retail space. It's an entire city block, broken up into kind of quadrants. There are different parts of the block. It's all one building, but one part of that block is 1 story, another part is 4 stories, for instance. It is a tremendously popular destination for people, in particular tourists who come to Portland. It's one of the things that we love about Portland, and I say this not as an employee. I mean, I moved here without a job at Powell's. The bookstore is really a community center in a way that it may be in other towns, but it's such a big building, and it occupies such a large part of Portland's consciousness. That it's kind of hard to escape, and most people who visit Portland come to Powell's. Many people who come to Powell's spend hours in the building because it's that big. There's about 1 million books in the one building, new and used, side by side, a lot of out-of-print stuff, rare book room. And I do think, first of all, I think operating a business of that scale demanded a certain level of expertise within a range of skill sets, stuff that people may not think about that much. I mean, security, for instance, it's a very big building. There are stories from back in the day, for instance, and this is way back in the 70s, but of a customer falling asleep in the corner of an aisle and waking up in the middle of the night. Somehow he wasn't spotted. This was, granted a long time ago, but called Michael Powell at 2 o'clock in the morning from one of the store's phones, woke him up and said, "Sir, I'm stuck in your store." It's a big place, and we're a little bit more thorough about that kind of thing now. But I guess you learn as you go, and certainly the number of people with a real passion and an expertise for books of one kind or another, was really vital in terms of building out the website, which hopefully delivers some of that to the rest of the world.
Now, since this is a special series on the program about the future of books and reading, I'm going to move beyond the bricks and mortar and the physical books and talk a little bit about how Powell specifically has harnessed technology. The first thing I want to mention is on the website, it's the blog, and before the Powell's blog, I didn't really know stores to be blogging entities. How did that develop?
We had been doing content for many years before that, 7 or 8 years before that. By content, I mean extensive original author interviews, essays, Q&As, that kind of stuff. But all this content tended to exist in a very rigid, strict format. You would write a book review, or you would do an interview with an author. And, as blogs were becoming more common, it occurred to us that they presented a platform through which we could present more of the casual life at Powell's. It wouldn't have to be something as formal, for instance, as I am going to review this book. You could actually just talk about the books you've been reading, for instance. It wouldn't necessarily have to be thousands and thousands of words of a highly edited, sculpted interview. It could be something much more, off the cuff, where an author is writing about whatever the heck they want to write about that day. It felt like an opportunity to let people in on the atmosphere here. As you said at the beginning of this conversation, it's a really fun place to work. It's a very interesting place to be. There are always conversations going on. You can't walk 2 feet without someone talking about a book of some kind, or an author wandering through, whatever the case might be. And that's the kind of casual, lively environment that we wanted to replicate online. The blog seemed a perfect place to do that.
And one of my other favorite features is the review a day, where you link up to a book review from a different publication every day. And what genius invented that?
Her name was Georgie Lewis, still is Georgie Lewis. She actually is, she's Australian, and she's back in Australia now, but she worked here for, I think, about 7 or 8 years. And, that just kind of came out of, like most things we do, kind of came out of a lot of brainstorming together. And she just thought it was something that would be fantastic to have herself. My God, it would be really cool if every day I got a book review, and it was always from a different source, so it wasn't the same voice and the same perspective. And that's where it started. And we did it 5 days a week when it was first born, maybe 7 years ago, and it's been 7 days a week now for a while. And we switch in and out hosts to keep it fresh. But it's a lot of fun. It's a really popular feature, and we actually read it internally as well.
These features, the reviews, the interviews, the blog, if I saw that sort of thing on most booksellers' websites, I would think to myself, well, this is just sort of this is a business, this is a place that's trying to move merchandise. How do I know that these aren't just devices to move merchandise? And I never get that image from the Powell's site. How do you avoid that?
It's a line that we walk. We are a business, and our bottom line is dependent on people buying books from us. So, we are constantly considering how much time and effort and money, in some cases, we are dedicating to, what you might consider more of a content feature. Certainly not a hard sell, like Review a Day. I mean, we've had reviewers trash books in Review a Day, and sometimes the author or the publisher is not necessarily pleased. When we do it, we try very hard to present on another day a different opinion. Let someone else review it who has a different take. But the fact is that, if I don't know anybody who'd subscribe to a Review a Day service and really sort of feel like they could trust it if every single book was a rave. And that's the relationship that, hopefully we are developing with our online customers. I think it's not altogether different than what you'd get in a bookstore that you trust, or for that matter, a furniture store. I mean, you want to go in and you want the person helping you to be honest about what they're selling you, and to try to cater to your particular needs and wants. So, no book is right for every person, and that's part of the challenge, is to get people in, to let them see what's available, and to find what's right for them at that place and time.
The next thing I want to mention is, of course, the out-of-the-book films, these short movies about authors and books that I mentioned at the top of the interview. And since you've been so involved in them, I guess I'd like to find out, why did they seem like a good idea? Because I watch them and I think, hey, this is an excellent idea, but I never would have thought of it myself. How did they come together?
It was a very natural evolution of a number of projects that were ongoing here. Like I said, we've been doing this content for a long time, for instance. We have author events in our stores. We have hundreds and hundreds every year. But a couple things occurred to me. One was that the author events, as gratifying as it might be to get to meet an author in person and hear them read, they, on the other hand, can be very dull. Authors are not necessarily authors because they're good performers. Touring can be an arduous and thankless process, frankly. City to city, day after day, alone on the road for an author, sometimes without very big crowds, but in any case, a lot of work and a lot of handshaking for, again, a profession that does not necessarily derive value from that kind of interpersonal communication. I mean, journalists do that, but not so much novelists. It just seemed like there was a way to make the relationship between the author and the reader more exciting. Instead of worrying about how the author is going to feel when he gets off the plane and goes to the reading, and instead of limiting the contact to a scripted 12-page section from the book and a 10-minute Q&A, we thought, there's an opportunity here to really let the author shine. In the case of the Ian McEwan film, we went over to England. We filmed him in his house. We filmed him in various sets in London. We went down to Chesil Beach, and we filmed from the setting of the book. Similar tactics with the David Halberstam film. He had passed away, so we obviously didn't have access to David, but we talked to Jean, his wife, and Joan Didion and Bob Woodward, and all sorts of people who really had incredible insight into his work. And that, to us, felt like value. I mean, that felt like something that readers were not getting. And if you are a book nerd, as I think a lot of us are here at Powell's, again, it felt like, man, this would be cool. I'd love to see this for fill in the blank of whoever your favorite author is. And, it really grew from there. We have relationships with independent booksellers around the country. We partner with them to screen the film in their towns and cities. We give them the film and promotional materials for free. We promote it on our website. We just announced today, actually, a film for the fall, which is going to be about a collection called State by State, 50 authors, each writing about one state. I mean, an incredible list of authors like Sarah Vowell and Jonathan Franzen. And we hope that it's going to be in 100 cities between the book's publication date on September 16th and the election on November 3rd. And the election's on the 4th. But we think it's a great jumping-off point for people to talk about the country. And what better time to do it?
These first two films, the Ian McEwan one on Chesil Beach and, of course, the David Halberstam on The Coldest Winter, how did those authors end up being the first ones filmed? Or not in the second case since he wasn't filmed, but how did those books end up being the choices for the first two out-of-the-book films?
For the first, Ian McEwan, we knew that we wanted someone with a broad commercial appeal, but someone who was critically successful, critically acclaimed. We wanted it to represent, we knew that it had to be an author that Powell, as a company, would stand behind. And of course, people around the country needed to be excited enough about this author that they would, whether if you were a bookstore, you would host a film, and if you were a customer in that town, you'd go watch it. We loved McEwan. I had interviewed him previously for the website, and he had a book coming out on Chesil Beach. He did not plan to tour. He was going to do just a few cities. And so I spoke to his publisher, Nan Talese at Random House, and we worked out this arrangement where basically we just asked for one day of his time. We went over to London. We spent, 4 days in England, but only one day with Ian. And, that was fine. He loved it. He felt like he got to reach a wide audience just by giving one day of his time in his hometown to our crew. And, it was really successful. And I think from the success, the Halberstam was born.
Now, when you're trying to pitch this to, say, the publisher, you want to get an interview, you want to get a day of McEwan's time, for example, how easy or difficult is it to get this concept across of out-of-the-book films? Because it's a new concept.
It's getting easier and easier. I think with McEwan, there were real questions to answer. We'd never done this, and there was, I will go to my grave kind of being thankful for the faith that Nan Talese and Nicole Dewey and the rest of the people at the publishing house showed in us. And not to not to mention McEwan himself, to think that we could get this right. We'd never made a film before, and we did hire and work with a very professional group of filmmakers, but nonetheless, it was the first partnership of its kind, and obviously they had no model to view and say, yes, it's going to be something like that. It was basically just what came out of our mouths. And, again, it was much easier for the Halberstam, though I would point out, and you've seen them both, we shot them very differently. They have a very different look, a very different feel. Obviously, there was a different approach because David Halberstam was no longer around to participate, so, working without the author was a challenge in itself. But ultimately, the more we do it, the more people see the possibilities. And I actually think the biggest step was having the Halberstam film and having two different films that addressed two very different subjects, a short novel set in 1962, and then a long history about foreign conflict and political affairs internally in the country. Being able to show people that range, I think, gives them a great amount of confidence that when we come to whatever book it is we're talking about with them, that we do have the ability to get it right.
Speaking of the contrasting look and feel of the two films, when you were in production on them, either one or both, how much did you know, how well did you know how these were going to turn out, what they were going to look like, how they were going to play while you were making them?
I think we all had ideas in our head. We talked about it a lot. We knew what the goal was in terms of we wanted to engage people. We wanted people, particularly, say, with the McEwan, it was very much our objective to get people to watch this, whether they had any intention of reading the book or not. We wanted the content in itself to be engaging. We wanted to entertain people. But we did not want to disrespect the work itself or the fans who hold these writers in such high esteem. And we knew that. From that, I think, piece by piece, we figured out ways to thread the story through so that a viewer would really feel like they got into the story and they wanted to read it. But, at the same time, we were consciously not creating a dramatization. The point was not to act out scenes, and in fact, we didn't have the license to do that. So, and again, we knew that music would be involved, for instance. We really wanted interesting soundtracks. We did not want two people in a room having a conversation with a white background and a lot of quiet space. So, I think we knew, at least conceptually, a lot of things that we wanted, and we definitely had some very specific goals about the way that the film would be received, and that more or less guided us.
Now, the Powell's Book of the Month Club, indispensable, what is that?
Well, it's actually every 6 weeks we send out a new package to subscribers. People sign up for, it's $40 per box. The box, like I said, comes every 6 weeks, and we find books and we package them in such a way that we think basically someone gets a box on their doorstep, opens it up, and feels a particularly new and different kind of book joy. I think there are a lot of issues involved. One of them, we want to pick good books. We want to introduce readers to books that they might not otherwise find. But we also want to make those books special. So, for instance, the first two books that we did were packaged in custom slipcases, available only to indispensable subscribers. They were all signed and numbered. And everything we send, boxes always come with other goodies. We have in each box what we call an unbound zine. It's a card set that includes some very fancy autographed author cards of the featured authors, kind of like baseball trading cards, only a little bit fancier and bigger. Content like interviews with the featured authors, or maybe some original writing by the featured authors, that kind of stuff. And we've done some other fun things too, like for instance in the first box, one of the goodies was a shortbread cookie dipped in white mint chocolate shaped in the shape of an elephant. It was a riff on something in the book. The book itself had an elephant's eye on its cover, on the jacket. And again, the idea is that people are just excited to get this, that every 6 weeks they should be really just thrilled that they're going to get what amounts to a care package from Powell's. And it's been really successful so far. We sell out of each new installment in about 5 or 6 hours. We currently have more than 500 subscribers, and we expect to have about 1,000 by the fall.
I think that every book geek that tunes into the show is going to be salivating at the prospect of those packages, and not just because of the cookie either. That's some seriously cool stuff you put in there.
It's fun. I mean, it really, again, everything comes back to being really, really book-loving people here. And, I think that there is a kind of litmus test that says, how would we feel about this? We were very conscious when we created the Indispensable program that we asked ourselves, what could we put in the box that would thrill us if we were the subscriber? And, obviously now we have feedback and we kind of hear what people like or the ideas that other people come up with. But it's really just making books fun. It can be really great to get a surprise in the mail from somebody who, it's like getting a mixtape from a friend with good taste. And, it's kind of what we're trying to do. Send stuff along that again, like I said, that they might not find otherwise, and to do it in such a fashion that it's in the condition that they actually want to show it off.
You work at Powell's, this place that is alive with a love for books, and you do all these neat things that are different, that aren't the usual staid book things. You do films, you do these indispensable boxes. How do you reconcile the life you live and all that neat stuff with all these gloom and doom reports that always come out about, books are dead, they'll die a week from Tuesday, nobody reads anymore, and so on and so forth? How does that cognitive dissonance affect you?
It's just reality. I mean, I think people have been talking about the death of the novel since, a couple days after the first novel was written. And, that's just an example. There's no question that the industry is changing. There will be a migration of some portion of the market to digital, for instance. There's nothing we can do about that, and frankly, we're not looking to get in the way. I mean, this is just evolution. It's the way things work, and if more books are in the hands of more readers, regardless of the format, then it's probably a good thing. I think the challenge for us is more or less the same as it's always been. It's evaluating and trying to make sense of the changes that are going on, and really identifying the value that we bring to a customer in the middle of that environment. Why is Powell special, and what can we do? The Indispensable program is a good example where, as more and more goes digital, I'm a firm believer that there is a huge, huge opportunity to really celebrate the beautiful physical product that a book can be. Not all books are like that. Some books, your mass market paperbacks or whatever the case, they feel a bit more disposable. And frankly, they probably will be among the first to see their audience migrate to digital formats and ebooks. But, a publisher like McSweeney's is a great example. Their books are so beautiful and so intelligently created physically that even if you don't intend to read it, you might buy it. I have several McSweeney's collections at home that I've never read, but I love them, and I have them basically on display in my house so I can look at them. And, I think that it's just recognizing, like I said, what excites our customers and what we can do to serve that. And that answer is always changing.
Wise words. Dave, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the program.
Well, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
If you'd like more information on Kevin Smokeler, visit kevinsmokeler.com. That's Smokler. If you'd like more information on Powell's books, visit powells.com. That's Bowells. Our music is composed by Ben Althouse. Check out his website, Ben Althouse, that's BenAlthouse.com. For more information and our online show archive, visit ColinMarshallRadio.com.